Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. I'm joined today by Dr. Thomas Seager. Tom, thank you so much for coming to Seattle, coming down to Optispan headquarters today on a Sunday of all days, which is why I got my Seahawks shirt on. And I know you're going through your Optispan Gateway Day tomorrow, so that's going to be a big day for you. And are you excited about that?
I'm not sure what to expect.
Yeah.
I'm actually, it feels like I'm being called to the principal's office. I'm going to get a report card and I want to know what's on there, but I kind of don't want to know.
It's all good. I mean, I think, certainly my philosophy is that sort of information is power, right? And, our perspective is that health is a journey, or health span is a journey. And our goal is to really do everything we can to figure out where each individual is at currently, and then what are some strategies people can take to get themselves closer to an optimal health span, which I think aligns very much with sort of the philosophy that you've sort of adopted over the last several years. I know your background is in civil engineering, and your day job, I believe, is still as an associate professor at Arizona State University.
Arizona State School of Sustainable Engineering.
Yeah. But over the last few years, you've very much moved into the health, I don't know how we would phrase it, health and wellness world, for lack of a better phrase. You started a company, Morozco Forge, a few years ago now.
Yeah, this was 2018. We started an ice bath company, and I thought it was going to be kind of a side gig, fun thing to do. Maybe we'll build a couple ice baths a week or something like this. Our first sale was January 2019.
Okay.
And I probably don't need to remind you of the timeline, because March 2020, the country went on lockdowns, and that changed my life. It changed my career trajectory. It made me angry about a lot of things that I still probably have a chip on my shoulder about, and decided I didn't want to be a disaster response infrastructure kind of usual sustainability guy. I wanted to get back into the origins, what I consider to be the origins of my profession, which is public health. You're a medical doctor, and
I'm a PhD, actually. We're both PhDs.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
Right, I'm Professor Seager. I don't want people to be asking me for prescriptions or something like that. I don't give medical advice, but because I'm in environmental engineering, there has always been a mission in environmental to protect public health. I mean, it used to be clean air, clean water, pollution. And for the most part, in the developed countries, those problems have been solved. And so my profession has moved on to really more complex, abstract things. When I was an undergraduate, is the ozone hole. You can't see it, you can't smell it or feel it, but it's really important environmentally. Now it's become climate change. I want to get back to public health.
So it's interesting that you say that in developed countries, these problems have mostly been solved. And yet it seems like, at least, we're starting to hear a lot more about some newer environmental challenges that people are becoming very concerned about. I mean, air pollution obviously is not new, but that's an ongoing problem that clearly impacts health. And I think I and others would argue directly impacts the biology of aging. We're hearing a lot about microplastics, other stuff in the environment that might be affecting testosterone, which I know something, and other reproductive hormones, which I know is something you're very interested in. So I guess I'm trying to reconcile that part with the idea that we actually have solved a lot of these environmental challenges.
I became an environmental engineer because I was born in Pittsburgh in 1966. We got your former quarterback now.
Yeah, that's right, Russell Wilson.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure how it's going to work out.
We'll see.
But yeah, I'm a Steelers fan because I was there for Mean Joe Green and Terry Bradshaw in the 1970s. Before I was born, I think there was a journalist visited Pittsburgh and said it looked like hell with the lid off. It was so polluted. The rivers were sewers, and the air was just a repository for the smoke from the steel mills. And that's the way that people felt secure. It meant that they had jobs. It meant that they weren't going back to the Depression, or maybe it meant that the factories were working in the service of the war. Like, our whole attitude towards the environment has evolved. We would never go back to hell with the lid off in Pittsburgh because our values have changed. So over the course of my lifetime, The problems have shifted from ones that you can taste and smell. You know the air is wrong. You know the water is bad, to ones that you need sophisticated instruments to detect. So we're now talking about microplastics.
Yeah.
That never would have been part of the conversation in Pittsburgh in the 1970s. We're like, how do we get the sewage out of the river was the issue. So when I say they've largely been solved, I'm talking about these industrial era problems of clean air, clean water. Those two pieces of legislation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, have been replicated in developed countries all over the world. And they've made an enormous difference in our immediate sensory experience with our environment. So now we sort of have the luxury of talking about PFAS or brominated flame retardants or all these things that we have no idea. They sort of sneak up on us. And I am not defending microplastics or Roundup or any of these things that are injuring our health in these really subtle ways. When you look at life expectancy, it had been going up, 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 up in the United States. And that was a testament to improved healthcare infrastructure and an improved environment. But then it peaked in 2014. So why is it going down? It almost set a new record, depending on how you measure it, in 2018, and it has fallen off a cliff in 2020.
Yeah.
Although many of the people in your audience might be concerned about the latest sort of forever chemicals that are accumulating in their environment. We can detect them in breast milk, for goodness sakes, and we don't want them there. The serious threats to our life expectancy that have emerged that I'm caring about, they're mental. These are self-inflicted injuries. These are death by drug overdose, by suicide, and the iatrogenic errors, the medical errors that, now you could say, how many quality of life years are lost by a medical error in someone who's already sick? When you take this Quali's perspective, it is the young people who are killing themselves that are the object of my attention right now. We have an extraordinary mental health crisis in this country. I think engineering has something to offer, and most of my colleagues disagree. But that's my primary concern.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So a couple of thoughts occur to me. I mean, I think what you said about the idea that the sort of obvious environmental toxins or poisons that we smell, taste, touch are less abundant than they used to be, certainly. And now it's the hidden stuff that is kind of hard. And one of the challenges that makes it more difficult to pinpoint how big is the effect.
Correct.
So it creates a lot of fear, which probably feeds into the mental health challenges and stress that people are experiencing. But is it on par with these other, environmental problems that we had 20, 30 years ago? Yet in other parts of the world, I'm thinking China and India in particular, those are the problems right now, right? So it also depends on where you're at.
Their rivers are still choking on garbage and sewage, absolutely.
And also what you said about life expectancy and, particularly I think the drug epidemic that is killing so many younger people, and that's where you really see the impact on life expectancy. Clearly, a major societal problem. But I would also say, I think one of the things that I think a lot about is even with increases in life expectancy, how much of those years are quality years?
The good ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not lifespan, it's health span,
right.
Which you've incorporated straight into your messaging.
And I would argue, though, that if you actually look over the last 40 years, it's difficult. It depends a little bit on how you define health span, but it's difficult to make a compelling argument that health span has actually increased. We've done a good job at keeping people alive longer, but most of those people have chronic disease, at least one, often more than one. So there's a lot of complicated challenges
It's
here.
been incredibly expensive to add those low quality years to the end of their life. And my parents, who have both passed away, God rest their soul, are good examples. My father, he was born in 1930. And he had a different attitude towards doctors and towards medicine than I have, because he thought of his health as his doctor's problem. And at first I was really angry with him.
That's interesting.
Before he passed, he was sort of bragging, because my father's a weird guy, about all the different kinds of cancer in his body. And I said, well, Dad, what are you going to do? And he said, oh, that's my doctor's problem. Like, that's a crazy attitude. But from his perspective, I can see how it made sense. He has health insurance. He has Medicaid, Medicare, whatever at his age. And when you go to the doctor, which is where health problems, you know, that's where you're supposed to go to take care of a health problem for his generation. The doctor says, well, let's see if we can get you a referral for this or approved for that, or you need an order to do this. And for his generation, it really was that somebody else was in charge. Every experience of healthcare he had was either moderated or decided by someone else.
Did you get the impression he was happy with the quality
No,
of healthcare that he
no.
received?
I think that on a personal basis, he liked his doctors, but institutionally, he wasn't satisfied at all because you bump up against all of the limitations
Yeah.
and all of the frustrations that happen when you're a patient. The difference now is that we have broadband internet. People don't start with their medical doctor. They might like their medical doctor, but they don't trust the FDA, the CDC, the government, the policies, the food pyramid, all the things that have been revealed as damaging to our health. So they go to the web and they find Healthline or WebMD or Cleveland Clinic or Mayo Clinic or any other website that they trust to get what they hope is objective information, and then they start diagnosing themselves.
Yeah.
And so that creates that meme, don't confuse your internet search with my medical degree. But the fact is that the medical degrees are out of date. I'm not sure when you completed your doctorate, but the only way for you to stay up to date is to read the literature.
Sure.
You've got the lab equipment. You're generating new knowledge. And this is what a PhD trains us to do. A medical doctor, they go through all of their schooling, and they don't have any time to read. They're seeing patients or they're performing surgery. They're not generating new experiments. So they kind of get locked into a way of thinking that is obsolete.
I somewhat agree. I mean, I think a lot of what you said, certainly I would agree with. I think also, though, there is a cultural challenge with the current practice of medicine, which is really, what I call the repair shop mentality, right? Of waiting until a problem surfaces before you do anything about it. So, I mean, we could spend hours just talking about the systemic challenges of the current healthcare system, I think. But I would also say, I'm not sure that the approach of going to WebMD or, the latest and greatest internet influencer to get your health information is any better. In fact, I would suggest that it's probably in many ways worse. And it really, I think what we get left with is this situation where nobody knows what to believe anymore, which I think is one of the real challenges in this space right now is, how do you identify the credible information? How do you, and you've said that the training that medical professionals get is rapidly becomes obsolete because of new knowledge, new technologies, things like that. How do we solve that problem, I think, is really the question. And I don't know if you've got thoughts on it. I certainly do. That's one of the things we're trying to do at Optispan. But, I think that's really one of the questions we need to answer is how do we both enable medical providers to practice cutting edge, science-based, proactive healthcare, and enable consumers to get access to high quality information, or at least be able to start to judge, who's giving them good information, who's perhaps giving them misinformation.
There are two things about this. The first is the practice of medicine is going to change. It already is changing. This repair shop analogy is quite apt. When you and I were kids, you had to learn about cars, you had to know how does the engine sound, and you had to tune the exhaust, and cars needed tune-ups. Now they're all run by computers. I wouldn't be able to fix anything in a car, if I had a manual. Well, the same thing is happening in this repair shop mentality of healthcare because the diagnostics are not going to be done by experienced medical professionals. They're going to be done by AI algorithms, and the AI algorithms are probably going to be better than 99% of the doctors that you would otherwise encounter. So that's one thing that's changing. The other thing is, how do we solve this problem of the knowledge becoming obsolete? My attitude as a scientist has changed. For me, it was about data and peer-reviewed journal articles and the P factors, and COVID changed all of that. The papers that were discarded or retracted because they were fraudulent. They were discovered by citizen scientists, not by the medical establishment. The one thing that's really interesting the lockdowns did was elevate the citizen scientists because now they have access to the literature, they have access to the data, they have access to the computing power for the tools. And this wasn't something that could happen in the past. Well, I started posting things about my own experience with my testosterone. I did my ice baths, I did my exercise, I got my labs, and my testosterone went up to like 1180 nanograms per deciliter. That's unheard of for a fat college professor in his 50s, you know? I posted this up on Twitter so that people could react or learn for themselves. And there was a deluge of people claiming to be medical doctors or other experts saying there is no double-blind, placebo-controlled, gold standard, study with a p factor, whatever, that says the thing that happened to you actually happened to you. And I realized it doesn't matter. Only thing that matters is your n equals 1 experience. So when I come into your gateway and you gather all of this data on me, whatever's in the Lancet is just now a source of hypotheses for how I might run my own experiment as long as I have access to monitoring my own health condition. In Arizona, thank goodness, I can order my own labs.
Yeah.
I'm no longer mediated by a medical doctor. I can say, aha, this is working or this is working.
I think that's correct, although I think the challenge for many people will be how do you know what to measure and how do you know how to interpret it, right? So I think biomarkers are great, right? And I probably know as much about biomarkers as almost anybody else out there, at least in the area of aging biology. And yet I will be the first to admit that I don't know how to predict with a high level of confidence whether or not a set of biomarkers is definitively telling us whether or not your biological aging process has been mitigated, right? Which is the goal,
Agreed.
one of the goals.
Yeah.
So I think this is a challenge, and I think we've got a set of biomarkers that we can be pretty confident about, and then we've got a bunch of speculative stuff, and this is where I think the noise and the misinformation becomes really, really challenging because I struggle to separate the signal from the noise. So I know that people who don't have my background are really challenged at doing that. So I agree completely with you. I think it's great that people have access. They can go and they can get their own blood work. They can choose what they want to get measured, right? You talked about testosterone. This is an area that I think is it's a really good case example, right? You can measure testosterone, you can measure free testosterone, you can measure LH, FSH, SHBG, you can go through the whole list. And all of those things together can tell you a story that testosterone alone won't tell you if you know how to interpret it.
Right.
But most people don't know how to interpret it.
Right.
And this is where maybe, and I say maybe, I think what you said about AI is correct. We will get to the point where we'll have these AI tools that can do as well or better than many doctors, medical professionals. But at this point, I don't think they're there yet. So again, I'm just interested to see how you think about that, because I agree completely conceptually, but I'm very nervous about the actual implementation of what you said because of all the misinformation that's out there.
We used to have the problem of not having enough information.
Yeah.
And so, you can go back to the 60s or the 70s before image scans were really sophisticated. Your doctor would listen to your heart and take your blood pressure. And this is all the information you had.
Mm-hmm.
And increasingly subtle signals, that is, fainter signals, earlier detection was enabled by advancing technology. And for a long time, that was a good thing. And then Gilbert Welch, he wrote a book called Overdiagnosis. The problem now is too much information and sorting out the information that is important, the strong signals, from just the noise.
Right.
And if what you're looking at is noise, you're going to find something. You're going to find a diagnosis that shouldn't be made. And that's going to lead to an iatrogenic therapy that isn't therapeutic at all. So we have people doing preventative mastectomies, for example. And that they get to decide for themselves. But I'd be horrified by the thought of my daughter getting a preventative mastectomy because she got some gene from me that may not even be expressed. When we search so hard for what's wrong, we start finding things that are wrong. And it can be dangerous in the name of early detection to act too soon on the information.
I think that's true, but I also, in some ways, personally, I think that's a bit of a that's a bit dissatisfying, because really the question is, for every diagnostic, what is the right balance? Because the flip side of that is, if you can detect a stage 2 cancer early and the tissue of origin, you're much more likely to be able to cure that than if it's a stage 4 cancer. So, when we think about things like the liquid biopsy multi-cancer detection test, I think you can have or we could have a legitimate conversation, and we might end up disagreeing, both from a legitimate perspective about, where is the risk reward. Um, so I think I guess the way I think about it is the risk of overdiagnosis, the risk of false positives in particular, is something to be aware of, certainly, and cognizant of the cascading downstream consequences. Having said that, I also tend to push back against the idea that we should avoid those things because of that risk, right? It's always, and again, this is kind of, I think, the tension between what I call 20th century medicine and, I think, where we're going, 21st century medicine, hopefully, which is, reactive versus proactive. Reactive would be, don't do the diagnostics, wait until the symptoms appear, and then try to treat the disease. Proactive, the extreme of proactive would be, let's measure everything and then try to act on everything. And I guess the right answer is somewhere in the middle, as with most things.
I
But how do we
agree.
find that middle, I think, is the challenge. And I mean, you'll have the option to think about this. So one of the things tomorrow, right, as part of your gateway day, so there's point of care ultrasound, which is, a screening tool to look for problems by ultrasound, and then you can be referred for, additional follow-up diagnostics. But we also do the Gallery test, which is this liquid biopsy multi-cancer detection test. So that's a perfect example of what you were
Yeah.
talking about.
It's part of why I want to know, because I feel it's my obligation as a scientist, as an artist, as an author, to go have these
Yeah,
experiences,
I think that's right.
interpret them for people.
Yeah.
And partly I don't want to know, because what if we find something in there? It's going to change my attitude. It may cause alarm for
Yep.
me. And I've been through this experience before. The thing that really got me into ice baths was an elevated PSA. So prostate specific antigen.
Yeah.
Now I was trying to get more serious about my health. I'd lost some weight. I'm going through a divorce. I need to date again. So I'm becoming more self-conscious about my appearance. But I'm also, early 50s is a time for me to start thinking about longevity, because my kids are growing up. I've done my job as a father. And instead of worrying about their health all the time, I'm thinking about my own. So I got the full health panel, and that damn PSA came back 7.0. Matt, this sent me into a panic, because, now I have broadband. Right now I have access to all these websites, and I spent an hour looking around. That's all it took to convince me I was going to die of prostate cancer, because these catastrophic thoughts, they
Right.
start playing in your mind. And I did not go see a urologist. I did not do anything that the websites told me that I was supposed to do, which is have a prostate exam and then a biopsy. Because when I talk to people about other men, about the rate of false positives, about the experience of the biopsy, about the rate of unnecessary prostatectomies, and about the miserable existence that they had, it was a different kind of nightmare. I thought, if I do this, it's going to lead to a cascade of additional treatments from which I will never be able to escape, and I will have a lifetime of erectile dysfunction as a result of these fears of prostate cancer. And I remember thinking, I'm going to do anything I can to avoid the medical system. When it comes down to it, I'd rather die of the prostate cancer if I get this wrong than live without an erection. Because in that point in my mind, I'm like, what woman is ever going to love me? What would my sense of it as a man be like? And I'm not saying this is the way I should think about it, or that other men should think about it. I'm saying when I'm up late at night and it's dark and these catastrophic thoughts are bouncing through my head, I'm like, there must be an alternative. So I doubled down on the ice baths. I'm like, ice baths are good for inflammation. Ice baths are good for my metabolism. I started cycling in and out of keto, and I got into that ice bath because something in my imagination was convinced that that was going to save my life. So I became religious about it. We'd already had Morosco Forge, but my own practice was as a curiosity. damned, Matt, if I didn't bring my PSA down. It went from 7 to like 1.1 at the low, and then I even stopped measuring. I'm like, forget about it. And that's how I discovered that my testosterone, which wasn't bad, it was in the 700s, went through the roof. At that point, I had a different sort of relationship with the internet. I'm saying this makes no sense. Everything that the other men I'd talked to said that their doctor had put them on testosterone blockers because testosterone, it promotes cell growth, and the fear here was that it would promote growth of cancer cells. Well, I said, it doesn't make any sense. I got to find out what's going on. 1991, there was a study in Japan. They did cold stimulation after exercise, like everybody knows how to do it, and they discovered that testosterone and luteinizing hormone went down. They reversed the order. They did the cold stimulation and then the exercise. So do your ice before the exercise, which nobody does, and testosterone and luteinizing hormone both went up.
Do we have a feel for how common that is? I mean, in other words, if you were to do this with 100 people, do we have a feel for like what % of people are likely to be responders to that?
They had something like 27 of these young men in this Japanese study, and they got statistically significant results, but there has never been a larger scale trial. And since 1991, you'd think somebody would be curious about this. There's been a lot of research on hormone replacement therapy, on testosterone replacement therapy.
Sure.
The bodybuilders have gotten really good at it. 1991 predates the whole steroid era in baseball. We've learned a lot more.
Is this something that bodybuilders do? And the reason I ask is I think oftentimes especially the bodybuilder community scientifically is a little bit ahead of the literature.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Is that something that is common in that world, this idea of a cold plunge before exercise?
No.
Huh. Interesting.
I got to meet Mark Bell. It was a lot of fun. Just like this, flew out to Sacramento. We did a podcast. And so I'm surrounded by these huge dudes. But Mark Bell's probably most famous for taking a quantity of steroids that they wouldn't dare give a racehorse. He did a documentary. The bodybuilders are ahead of the scientists because they're doing the N=1 experiments.
They're doing experiments on themselves. Yeah.
They know what works. And they share knowledge among themselves. And right now, ice bath before exercise is just starting to get into that community.
Okay.
The point is that since that 91 study, there's been a lot on pharmaceuticals, whether it's creams or injections. There's been a lot of improvements on making hormone replacement therapy safer, better, and it works. But there's been very little on, just get into the cold water and then do some push-ups or go for a walk. And so, because there's not a lot of money to be made on stimulating your body's own testosterone production.
Yeah, I get that, and I think we should be careful. The bodybuilders have been ahead of the science, but from a health span and lifespan perspective, no. I think we can all agree that's not a great strategy for living a long, healthy life.
And nobody's talking about the East German women's swim team levels. Like we've moved way past that.
Right. So I think this is super interesting. And again, from my sort of skeptical perspective, would love to see the controlled study, right? Or at least a large number of people before and after. Certainly biologically plausible.
Right.
And I think we would all feel more confident to see actual controlled data, right?
What I have now are half a dozen super well-documented case studies of people who have written to me, sent me their labs, said some of them on TRT, some of them not, and saying, this is where I was, and felt kind of stuck. Doing the TRT, I'm in the 800s, and everybody tells me that's great. I saw your podcast or I read your article. I started doing ice baths, and then I'd do some exercise, and I'd go up to 1,500 or 1,300, these super elevated levels.
How long does it stay up? Is there any information on that? I mean, we know testosterone, cycles throughout the day. Is this thought to be a sort of constant increase throughout the 24-hour cycle after a cold plunge and exercise?
It's a really good question because that 1991 study was a single point in time. There's been a longer study And gosh, the name of the author escapes me. And they did 48 hours post workout. They discovered, and this was with football players in Europe, so soccer players in the United States.
Yeah.
So these were pretty high level athletes. They did an intense workout using sprints, and they discovered that it lowers testosterone, it lowers luteinizing hormone. Immediately after a workout, you're not getting a testosterone boost, you're getting a cortisol boost.
You mean in the absence of any cold
in,
at all?
In just passive recovery, right?
Yeah.
And so then they said, well, we're going to investigate this cold water immersion thing. They use 55-degree water, which for me, that's tepid, you know? And so they left them in there for 15 minutes, 25 minutes, 35
And
minutes.
this is post-exercise or pre-exercise?
And then they took a number of saliva samples. And you can argue saliva is not as good as blood, but they did this. They're taking a lot of samples, so they're using saliva over 48 hours, and they're trying to track testosterone. The only thing, not passive recovery and not the 15 or 25-minute cold water immersion, the only thing that boosted testosterone levels over the longer haul, which would be 24 hours and later, was 35 minutes in 55-degree water. Now, I want to write to these guys and say, well, you should be doing 35-degree water. You should be doing 5 minutes. Like, there's a little bit of a signal. Let's up the dose and see if we can get a better response. But there's been very little work in this area of pre-cooling your workout and then measuring these sort of anabolic markers of whether you have the right hormone profile to rebuild the muscles that you just started breaking down. I'd love to see it. So I'm sending a Morozko to the Lithuanian Sports University. And you might be like, what the heck is that? I'd never heard of it until Marius Brasaitis published 2 papers on cortisol and cold exposure. This is the best work I've ever seen. He's drawing blood samples. He's doing it over time. Cortisol is tricky because, it's on a diurnal cycle, right, and he's doing really well-controlled work. And then it dawned on me that the best research on cold exposure or sauna or on any of the thermal contrast therapies is all in the countries that were behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, that were not NATO countries during the Cold War. That's Finland, that's Poland, that's the Czech Republic. These countries that are in Eastern Europe, why are they the ones who are doing the really good work on thermal contrast? Sweden is another one that comes to mind. And even though Sweden and Finland have very recently joined NATO, the work that I'm talking about predates these sort of political alliances. And Joe Rogan did his comedy special, and he admitted that he's become kind of a conspiracy theorist. I feel the same way. So many things have been revealed as politically contrived when we thought that they were scientific. Maybe it is these universities that we might think of as second tier that are beyond the reach of GlaxoSmithKline or beyond the reach of the pharmaceutical dollars that buy medical research and medical education. Maybe they're the ones who are doing the work because it's cheap work to do. They don't need a lot of sophisticated equipment.
I'm going to push back on that, not because I think that there isn't a bias towards certain types of research. I mean, I was at a tier 1 university for 20 years, ran a large research lab, got lots of NIH grants. Despite the fact that I hate writing grants, I'm really good at it. So
I know that feeling.
So what I would say is I had never experienced that sort of intentional shifting of what types of research are done. I think it's much more cultural, and it has to do with the way that NIH is structured, because most of the biomedical research comes through NIH, the way that FDA is structured. And I think the peer review process itself, which at least in the United States and many European countries, if somebody was to write an NIH grant to want to do the kinds of studies that I think we both would like to see done, right? These controlled studies looking at the effects of cold therapy prior to exercise, after exercise, quantitatively assessing the metrics, that grant would be a non-starter in most NIH study sections.
Agreed.
Not because the pharmaceutical companies are biasing the process, but just because of the culture of the way that the research enterprise has sort of evolved. Agreed. So, but I think it is real, and and I mean, we see this in the longevity field as well. There is a bias against these sorts of exploratory, non-cookie cutter sorts of therapeutics, right? And I think there is a need for resources to support that kind of research. The challenge is that they don't exist. And so we're left in this middle ground where you have, second tier, third tier institutions or foreign institutions from places where, again, I don't know what your perspective is. I think it's challenging sometimes when you see, a research paper from, I don't remember the name of the university that you talked about, but a university you've never heard of before in a country that is not known for having a strong culture of rigorous scientific literature. It's tough to have a ton of confidence, and so and when you oftentimes read these papers, you can identify limitations to the methodology. So we're left in this sort of middle ground where it's like, yeah, this is a super interesting study, but it's a study that was only done once on 20 people and wasn't really done well. How do I interpret that?
As a source of new hypotheses.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Because 70% I'm with you. I agree with what you're saying about the culture of the science funding apparatus. And then 30% I'm not. And it was the experience of the lockdowns that changed my mind. I have a friend at Stanford University, Jay Bhattacharya. And if you're following anything with regard to the politics of lockdowns, and you've probably seen him post, because he was referenced in emails that were obtained through the Freedom of Information Act by Fauci and Francis Collins at the NIH. He was pilloried as a fringe epidemiologist. He was censored. He was threatened. Stanford pulled the funding that he was doing on archived blood samples to discover when did COVID come into the country, how long has it been here, what does the curve really look like. That is not some sort of cultural milieu. It was a targeted attack to suppress research, and it changed the way that I think about writing science grants and doing science. For me, the term "there is no data" came up a lot during the lockdowns, and it was used to justify attacks that I felt were unwarranted against people scrambling to find any kind of therapy that might work. They're saying, well, look, let's try ivermectin. Let's try hydroxychloroquine. Let's try vitamin D. Lots of promising hypotheses. And yet the people who were saying, like Tony Fauci, there is no data that this is, were the same people who were suppressing the production of the data. So when you hear a scientist say there is no data, it should be an expression of curiosity. It should be, I wonder what kind of experiment we should run here during a very high stakes environment. We should run 100 different little trials and see what might pop up. But there is no data was used to shut down hypotheses, to shut down dialogue. And now when I hear people say it, I'm sort of triggered, Matt. Yeah. I'm like, wait a second, what's really going on? Yeah. That is the example, not cultural, but targeted attack to suppress information that might help people.
And I think that, so again, my view is that is a very rare thing. And I think the COVID and the lockdown were, once in a generation, 2 generation sort of experience where I'm not going to try to defend everything that happened at all. But I think people were reacting a lot out of fear. Certainly you could no doubt make a case that there was some profiteering happening as well. Okay, that's all real. I think that did happen. I think there's a lot of stuff that we still haven't figured out. Having said all of that, I think I would respond though to this. There is no data. I agree with what you said. That should be an opportunity for curiosity. Yep. But the flip side of it is you will see a lot, and we saw this during COVID, where it goes from, why don't we try this to this works? And I think when people claim that something works in the absence of data, that's where I use that phrase a lot. But my perspective is when somebody claims that something is true in the absence of data, that's religion. That's not science.
Yeah.
So I think there's this question of...
There is no claim that this worked. You can only say this worked for me or this worked for these people.
Or I did this and this happened. But again, you understand correlation does not equal causation, right? So I think that's where a lot of, the traditional scientific community, and I'd put myself in the bucket there, would come back and say, it's great that your PSA went down. That's fantastic. And it's great that you attribute it to cold plunge. Is that causal? I don't know in the absence of additional data, right?
Could that be replicated in other people? It's a huge question. Yeah. What bothers me is people who will say, well, where's your proof?
Sure.
Proof. I'll say, I'm a scientist. I don't do proof.
Yeah.
Maybe you need a mathematician or something, but no hypothesis can ever be proven.
Right.
It can only be disproven, because I'm bought into this sort of positivist approach that scientists are supposed to formulate these hypotheses and do their best to disprove them.
Okay, we agree completely on that. And I think this is one of my big frustrations, is I think a lot of scientists don't get that training, right? That our goal should be to build a model and then try to figure out, where is that model weak?
The
how
model's
do we disprove
wrong.
it?
All models are wrong.
Thank you.
Right.
Yes.
So you can come at me, you can say, well, that's wrong. And I'm like, yeah, let's make it less wrong. Let's keep improving it and adapt it. The PSA one, I'd love to see that study too. I would love to see it replicated in more people. But what I say to men is, there are no adverse effects. Give it a try. Experiment on yourself. You get into the cold water for 3 or 4 minutes. What is the adverse side effect? I mean, there could be discomfort. There maybe you don't like getting wet. There could be lots of things that you don't like. Try cryotherapy instead of cold water. There's this attitude is, what do you have to lose?
But I mean, aren't there case examples of people who have had heart attacks after getting in the cold water?
No. It's really interesting, because Mike Tipton is at the University of Portsmouth, and his career is mostly about drowning prevention. And so Wikipedia has latched on to Mike Tipton's publications on cold water swimming and created this article that says, oh, it's really bad for your heart. It can create autonomic conflict. Mike Tipton has hypothesized, he's speculated about the conflict between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. There's the gasp reflex when you get into the cold water, and you feel that shock in the sympathetic nervous system. And then there's the mammalian dive reflex, which is the parasympathetic taking over. Everything calms down. And Tipton has speculated that if you do this wrong, you can create a conflict between the gasp and the dive reflex that could cause a heart arrhythmia. I can't say he's wrong. I can't say he's right. It's just him thinking about how to prevent drownings, how drownings can be, or the risk of drowning can be more serious in cold water because of this gasp reflex. And more power to him. But somehow this has been amplified into the idea that there must be dozens of case studies of people who've suffered heart attacks in cold. Can't find one. And I have looked. There is one report of an autopsy done in the United Kingdom in which the medical doctor performing the autopsy speculated that this might be the result, because it was a cold water drowning, of some heart irregularity. And that's the closest we've gotten. Now, it's different if you want to look at hyperventilation and free diving, or if you want to look at people who are hyperventilating in the cold water because they think that's what Wim Hof told them to do, which is not true. But if you look at that, yeah, you're going to find shallow water blackout. That's not necessarily because the water is cold. It's because people lose, after hyperventilation, they lose the urge to breathe. They black out in the water, and then they drown. There are dangers to combining hyperventilation and cold water swimming or cold water immersion. So don't do that. Instead, leave your breath work for structured box breathing, not hyperventilation. When you're trying to strengthen that vagal nerve response, bring the mammalian dive reflex forward in the ice bath. That does not mean that is without risks. It means that Wikipedia and social media influencers are telling people the wrong things about risks. One of the contraindications to an ice bath is hypertension. So if you already have high blood pressure and you're going to get up to your neck in cold water, the vasoconstriction in your limbs is going to increase your blood pressure. There have been a couple of reports that have come back to me of an acute hypertensive incident that required medical supervision. No long-lasting effects, but you got to get people out of the cold. You got to rewarm them. And I'm not a medical doctor, but as it was explained to me, these people recovered fine because they had the medical supervision. If they didn't, I suppose it could have gone badly. There's also, even rarer, about 1 in 20,000, there's something called transient global amnesia. People who have lost their memory, which is a very frightening thing when they're in the cold bath. And they will never go back because they don't want to take that chance again. It's transient, and these people have recovered. But Dr. Mark Cohen, who's both an MD and a PhD in Australia, has been tracking the incidence of transient global amnesia as a result of cold plunge. And he says it looks to him like 1 in 20,000.
That's really interesting. I mean, again, this is a little bit tangential, but, I can't help but wonder whether that is a predisposition that certain people have, or if you were to do it 20,000 times, would you experience it, on average once every 20,000 times? I mean, who knows what the biology there is.
Seriously doubt. I'm at about 2,000. So we don't have a large enough data set.
You're not quite there yet.
Yeah. But I think that your intuition here, I agree with, that there's probably some predisposition within the body. However, I just did the sauna. Mike Mutzel's sauna is blazing hot. He's got a wood stove. He doesn't have any regulator in there, right? And we went back and forth between the sauna and the ice bath, which is the way the Finns do it, And I experienced this sensation of feeling high. I had some vertigo. The trees were spinning, and Mike goes, "Yeah, I really like that." Because that's why I do it.
It's funny,
right? It would not surprise me, especially if you're doing extreme thermal contrast.
Yeah.
If there are brain effects that result from whether it's oxygenation or whether it's from the vasodilation to vasoconstriction. And if you do lose touch with your ordinary sort of acute sense of consciousness, and so perhaps some of these cases of global transient amnesia are something that I've only experienced a little bit in this sort of altered state of consciousness that goes too far for them. I don't know.
I suspect you're right. And I mean, I think, there almost anything you do that is a major physiological shock, especially if it's influencing, like you said, blood oxygenation, right, or circulating hormones, has the potential to have profound brain effects, which then we perceive in all sorts of different ways, right?
Yep.
So that does not surprise me at all that you would have these reports of things like that, and they're going to be relatively rare. And are they good, bad, net? No effect. It's hard. It's really hard to say.
It's an experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. Which is, that's part of it, living a joyful and healthy life, right? Is having lots of different experiences, hopefully mostly positive.